So my hope and my prayer, frankly, is that we learn not to get rid of our anxiety, but we learn to harness it and to use it and to thrive because of it. And thank you very much. You want to just pass them up? How do you want to do it?
Can we ask you in person?
Yeah, that's fine if you want. All right, yes.
Firstly, thank you very much. And I wanted to ask you about the difference between Israel and the States. And you kind of mentioned it, that I would imagine that connection and closeness, intimacy, are really the antidote to anxiety. And I feel in Jewish life, we have such a great emphasis on family, on faith, that possibly those are things which reduce anxiety, that closeness and connection. That was one thing I wanted to.
Yeah, I think it's a great point in terms of cultural differences between the United States and Israel, and how family
and
culture
Jewish life.
and Jewish life, that's true, specifically Jewish values.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think relationships in the United States are much more tenuous. I see a lot of people out here enjoying life more, a lot more family-centric than in the United States. I was actually observing this the other day. So I was with my wife and her siblings, her siblings live in Jerusalem, thank God, it's very nice. And we're all at lunch, and I think one or two of us had phones on the table, but nobody was checking their phones. In the States, you go out for lunch, for dinner, there are 4 people at a table, everybody's on their phones. I haven't seen it here. I haven't seen that phenomenon here as much. Actually, it is? I don't know, maybe.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you as a follow-up to that.
What was that?
The other thing I want to ask you as a follow-up to that is if you ever look into family of origin, in terms of attachment, abandonment issues.
So the interpersonal, the interplay between interpersonal relationships, including family of origin, with anxiety is covered in the second part of my book, and definitely does have an impact. I will say that the relationships that we create tend to have more importance for the course of anxiety than the relationships that we were created from. Not that the latter aren't important, but it's not indelible. And often the effects aren't indelible. And the relationships that, again, the ones that we create, specifically romantic relationships, can be extremely curative and important in terms of the course of dealing with anxiety. The core of it, by the way, is if you're able to love somebody else and they really can love you, both of you aren't perfect people. I'm certainly not a perfect person, and my wife's close, but both of us, part of having any romantic relationship is being okay that you are not okay, and knowing that you're still beloved to someone else despite the fact that you're struggling. So it's related to the overall thing.
Compassionate to our human flaws.
Compassion, correct.
That's what passion is, right?
Correct.
He can
Correct.
be so weak.
Yeah, that.
You're basically saying to lead into your anxiety, but you hear people nowadays on podcasts talking about deep breathing and
Yes, I'm really glad you mentioned that. Yeah, so I'm saying you should lean into your anxiety, and a lot of people out there are trying to give tips and tools in order to reduce your anxiety. I generally speaking, am not a fan of such approaches. Now, yes, if somebody's anxiety is acutely so overwhelming that they cannot tolerate it, there might be certain, including medication, by the way. I'm not anti-pharm. I didn't emphasize that enough during my talk. There are certain things that you sometimes have to get it into a reasonable range that you can tolerate it. But the goal is to tolerate the anxiety, not to eliminate it. And if deep breathing, if the intention of deep breathing, there's actually research on this. If the intention of deep breathing is to get rid of your anxiety, that makes it worse. If that's your kavana in your mind, when you're doing that, it will make the anxiety worse. And it actually also makes the certain treatments, like exposure, less effective.
My
Yeah?
question kind of bases off of that one is like, you spoke a lot in the beginning about like how anxiety is a blessing. And my question is like, what about when it's more like it feels more debilitating than a blessing and like exposure therapy isn't the answer, let's say?
Yeah, good question. Firstly, if anxiety doesn't feel debilitating and if it feels like a blessing, you're not anxious. So I'm not saying anxiety is fun. It is very, very unpleasant. It is not geschmack, as they say. No, thank you so much. The blessing of anxiety is learning to be okay not being okay, and that your emotions sometimes are going to be completely overwhelming, and that's not the end of everything. Now, if you literally cannot tolerate that, then we have to get it into a reasonable range. And exposure therapy does admittedly push you up to 7,000 RPMs. But it could be that the car can only handle 5,000 or 4,000 or 2,500. Fine. So then we have to titrate it. But in addition to exposure therapy, there are other strategies that can be used. It's just the easiest to talk about in a one-hour form. Good questions though. By the way, just because somebody's exposure therapy doesn't work at one point in time doesn't mean it wouldn't work later. They might need multiple strategies to be able to handle, and I've seen this many times in my clinical practice where people didn't do it at first. They really needed to go on a different journey. They needed to develop relationships with others. They needed to feel more confident in their life. They needed to be more successful, have less financial pressure, whatever it was that was going on. And 3, 4, 5 years later, when things were a little bit more settled, then they're like, I'm in. I'm going to do this. So it's not necessarily a bad strategy for people. It just might not be the right card to play right now.